You know that heavy, quiet stillness when the final bell rings?
Oh, yeah. The hallways clear out, the fluorescent lights are just kind of humming.
Exactly. And it's just you sitting in the classroom, maybe talking to a colleague next door, and you're just dealing with that quiet, creeping guilt.
Right. The guilt that despite making the curriculum quote unquote easier today, you actually, well, you failed your most vulnerable students.
Yeah, that exact feeling. And that is the exact space we are stepping into for this deep dive. So, you know, pull up a chair. Today we're getting into session 4 of Vancouver educator Sean Smith's 6-part series, Dignified Differentiation.
And we've really been building up to something heavy here. I mean, we've covered the failure of traditional differentiation.
Right, how watering down a worksheet is definitely not the same as making it accessible.
Exactly. And we established dignity as a hard design constraint. But today's mission, this is really the crux of the entire framework.
It really is. We're exploring what it actually means to see a student clearly. And I mean, honestly, not hopefully, not sentimentally.
Which Smith himself calls the absolute hardest session in the series. Because looking honestly at a student, it requires stripping away all those comforting illusions we build around our daily practice.
Yeah, it demands a level of objective reality that, frankly, the education system actively resists.
Right.
But okay, let's unpack this. Before we step one foot into Smith's positive arguments about, setting realistic goals, we have to look at the dark, non-negotiable historical context.
We really do.
Because I have been in inclusive classrooms for over 30 years now. I've sat at those IEP tables and I have seen exactly how this language gets weaponized.
Yeah.
The claim that some students need genuinely different educational goals, that's not new. Historically, it has caused massive generational harm.
Oh, absolutely.
Words like realistic goals or appropriate expectations, they were used as institutional cover for the systematic underservice of students with disabilities, students of color, students from lower income families.
Right. The system would just look at a kid, decide they weren't capable of much, and basically lower the academic ceiling to the floor.
Exactly. Lower the ceiling, call it professional judgment, pat themselves on the back, and just abandon those students.
Which honestly forces us to look at the bigger picture here. I mean, if we connect this to what Smith is saying,
Yeah.
how do we know we aren't just repeating a historical pattern of underservice,
Mm.
just, with better intentions?
It's the most important question we could ask.
Right. Because how is this new language, this whole dignified differentiation and honest seeing, how is it any different from the old excuses?
Yes.
If you dress up the act of giving up on a student in progressive terminology, it doesn't change the mechanical fact that you're still giving up on them.
I completely agree. And any educator who doesn't have their guard up when they hear the phrase realistic expectations just hasn't been paying attention to history.
Yeah.
Smith's argument is only legitimate, and frankly, it's only safe to implement if we actively acknowledge this dark history and build ironclad safeguards against it. If we skip the safeguards, everything we're about to discuss just becomes a shiny new version of the exact historical misuse we are trying to eradicate.
Because the stakes are literally the entirety of a student's future trajectory.
Yes.
Shifting educational goals away from curriculum standards. I mean, you are walking on incredibly thin ice there. If you remove the pressure to hit standard benchmarks, the institutional gravity naturally just pulls toward doing less work.
It does, and that brings us to the core of Smith's argument. To prevent that historical harm from repeating, we have to stop conflating two entirely different student realities into one, generic, hopeful teaching approach.
Right, collapsing them into the same story.
Exactly. We have to definitively separate the underestimated student from the student with a significant cognitive disability. Right now, modern teaching culture collapses them into the exact same narrative.
And that first story, the underestimated student, that is the one the system absolutely loves to tell.
Oh, the movie script narrative.
Yes. The whole idea that a teacher's sheer belief can overcome all biological and systemic obstacles.
Right. So story 1 is the underestimated student. And the facts of this situation are empirical. This is a kid whose true potential is vast, but it's being actively suppressed by someone else's low expectations.
Or implicit bias or just systemic indifference.
Exactly. It's the kid placed in a lower track because of their zip code or maybe a behavioral misunderstanding. And the only appropriate pedagogical action here is to refuse to set a ceiling.
You keep the door wide open.
Keep it wide open. This student does not need different expectations. They need higher ones.
Right. They need a teacher who aggressively rejects the deficit narrative that the system has assigned to them.
Yes. But Story 2 is fundamentally different. Story 2 is the student with a significant cognitive disability. The facts here are not based on bias, they are based on a neurological profile.
Right.
We're talking about moderate to severe autism or a profound cognitive delay that basically dictates the student will require supported living in adulthood. This neurological reality is going to shape their life in permanent, lasting ways.
Which is a reality schools don't like to talk about.
No, they don't. But in this specific situation, the action of setting realistic goals is not underestimation. It is honest seeing.
Wow.
It's looking at this human being and asking the hard question. What does this specific person actually need to learn right now to navigate adulthood with dignity and independence?
And you can feel the discomfort educators have around Story 2. It is palpable because we're conditioned in Teachers College to be, champions of infinite, boundless potential.
Always.
So when you're faced with a biological or neurological reality that dictates a definitively different trajectory, the default response is panic. So the system just reverts back to treating them like Story 1.
Exactly. We treat a profound, lifelong neurological difference as if it's merely a temporary hurdle that enough professional belief can just magically conquer.
Right.
And conflating these two stories is actively dangerous for the student. Let's look at the mechanics of why. Imagine you have two students, okay? One needs prescription glasses to read the board. The other is completely blind and requires a Braille reader. Giving them both the exact same magnifying glass, calling it equality and hoping for the best. That is pedagogical malpractice.
Right, because it just completely obscures the real distinct needs of both kids.
Yes. It creates a cognitive traffic jam. If you hand a blind student a magnifying glass and try to teach them visual reading techniques, their brain is burning all its working memory trying to decipher blurry shapes.
Leaving zero cognitive capacity to comprehend the actual story.
Absolutely zero. Delivering the standard curriculum, hopefully year after year, to a student who fundamentally needs to be building functional life skills, it means those crucial skills go unbuilt. You haven't saved them, you've wasted their most critical developmental years.
But this raises an important question, right? Because in a theoretical discussion, the distinction between a visual impairment and a cognitive impairment is obvious. The kid who needs a Braille reader gets a Braille reader.
Sure.
But let's look at the reality of a crowded classroom. You have 32 kids, wildly varying needs, limited support staff, and a million competing administrative priorities. How do you know which situation you are actually looking at?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right? How do you know empirically that a student has a significant cognitive limitation and isn't just deeply structurally underestimated due to, say, a language barrier or trauma? If a teacher guesses wrong and assumes Story 2 when it's really Story 1, they have permanently capped that child's potential. Who protects the student from a teacher's bad guess?
And that exact terror is the root of the quiet guilt we covered in Session 1. Teachers are so paralyzed by the fear of getting it wrong, of being the villain who lowers the ceiling, that they just do nothing. They just keep handing out the magnifying glass. But Smith answers your question directly. Honest goal setting cannot ever be a solo endeavor. Isolation is the breeding ground for historical abuse.
Right.
What realistic goal setting is not, under any circumstance, is a single teacher making a quiet, unilateral decision at their desk to expect less from a kid. That is a ceiling lowered and left.
But a teacher feeling overwhelmed and quietly watering down a worksheet on a Tuesday morning, that's what happens in the vast majority of classrooms. So what mechanically stops that from happening?
The mechanism is a set of 4 ironclad collaborative safeguards. Smith outlines very specific prerequisites that must be met before any shift in educational purpose is even considered.
Okay, lay them out.
Safeguard 1. Has the student's family been given genuine space to share their perspective? And I don't mean a signature on an IEP document shoved across a table. I mean a real seated discussion about their child's long-term future.
Okay, but the theory hits a brick wall here. Let's dissect what a modern IEP meeting actually looks like. It is usually 15 minutes long.
If you're lucky.
Right. And the parents are usually intimidated by a table full of professionals firing off institutional jargon and acronyms.
That's true, which leads to Safeguard 2. Is this reality documented in an IEP with input from relevant professionals? This must be grounded in hard data psychoeducational assessments, support teachers, specialists.
Yeah, but furthermore, the psychoeducational assessment being cited is often 3 years out of date. because the wait list for the district psychologist is backed up for semesters.
I know, it's
So are we describing a safeguard that actually exists, or a fantasy that requires resources public schools simply do not possess? Like, who is really in the room when these decisions are made?
Look, you're right. It is a massive systemic failure, and acknowledging that is part of the work. But Smith's role is completely uncompromising here. If the answer to any of those safeguards is no, if the family isn't genuinely heard, if the current professional documentation isn't there, if the psych ed assessment is missing crucial metrics, the process is incomplete.
So you just don't do it.
Exactly. You do not get to shift the student's educational purpose. You keep pushing on the standard curriculum. You do not make the leap without the net.
But even if you manage to secure genuine family input, right,
Okay.
but you somehow get an up-to-date psych ed assessment, it is still just a snapshot of the student at a specific age. What prevents a school from making this monumental decision in the third grade, filing the paperwork, and essentially ignoring the kid's academic growth until high school?
That is exactly why Safeguard 3 exists. Is there a specific, hard review timeline to examine the evidence again? This is a non-negotiable date on the calendar where the entire team sits back down, looks at the data, and asks, were we right? Has the cognitive profile shifted? Let's check the evidence.
Okay, so it breaks the permanence of the decision.
Exactly. It keeps the door open. And finally, Safeguard 4. Has the student's own perspective been sought in whatever form is accessible to them? How do they actually feel about the material they are engaging with?
I mean, that review timeline is definitely the linchpin. It's the only thing preventing a temporary intervention from becoming a permanent life sentence.
Yeah.
However, if the system is already overloaded with overdue assessments, who is holding the administration accountable to that timeline? It falls back on the individual teacher to demand these meetings, which requires spending political capital with administration.
It does. That is the unavoidable fiction of doing this work, honestly. It requires demanding more from the system, not just, managing what you are given.
Yeah.
But let's assume the collaborative safeguards are met. You fought the battle, the family is fully on board, the psych ed assessment clearly indicates a significant cognitive disability, and the team is aligned. If we have safely established that this is story 2, what does this honest seeing actually look like when you finally open the textbook?
Right, because this is where the philosophical debate has to translate into pedagogical mechanics. If the safeguards are in place, what does Smith's solution actually look like compared to the watered-down worksheet we've been criticizing?
So Smith breaks this down into levels in his reimagined textbooks materials. Let's look at the mechanics of levels A and B first. In these levels, the reading complexity is adjusted down, but it acts merely as a scaffold. The conceptual destination, the rich intellectual content of the curriculum, remains the point of the lesson.
So, like, a student reading at a third grade level is still grappling with the same complex historical event or scientific concept as their peers.
Exactly.
Say the physics of the solar system, right? The text is simplified, but the cognitive demand of understanding gravity is still there. That's just standard, solid differentiation.
Yes, exactly the point. But for levels C and D, and remember, these are strictly for the students with significant cognitive disabilities where those 4 safeguards have been fully met, the pedagogical purpose completely shifts.
Okay, how so?
The narrative remains intact. The dignity of the materials remains. They aren't handed a primary school phonics book with cartoons of teddy bears while their peers are reading about the solar system. They get a text about the solar system. But content acquisition is no longer the primary goal.
Wait, so the goal isn't learning the physics of gravity?
No, it isn't. The curriculum content becomes a vehicle for building the functional reading and comprehension skills that student will critically need for the rest of their life.
Oh, okay.
Let's look at cognitive load theory here. The brain only has so much working memory. If we demand that a student with a significant cognitive disability learn the abstract physics of planetary orbits, their working memory is entirely consumed by a concept they will likely never need to apply independently.
Right.
But if we use that dignified, age-appropriate text about the solar system to practice decoding, identifying high-frequency sight words, and building basic functional comprehension, we free up their working memory to build a life skill. The subject matter is the vehicle. The life skill is the destination. So what does this all mean? It means this is a recalibration.
See, philosophically, this is where the pushback gets incredibly intense.
I know it does.
Because is this purpose shift genuinely different from what happens in traditional modified programs? I mean, for decades, schools have put students on life skills tracks where academic content was essentially abandoned. They were sent down the hall to bake muffins while the rest of the class did science.
Yep.
Is Smith just taking that exact same exclusionary practice and wrapping it in better language? And furthermore, who has the moral authority to decide that functional life skills matter more than curriculum content for this specific kid? When we say content is just a vehicle, aren't we fundamentally declaring that this student is incapable of learning the content itself?
That is the uncomfortable, sharp edge of this entire philosophy.
Yeah.
But Smith's counterargument is that it is fundamentally different from the old modified programs because of two things: the dignity of the materials and the integration within the inclusive classroom.
Okay, so they aren't baking muffins down the hall.
Right. The student isn't isolated down the hall. They are in the room, engaging with the same overarching narrative as their peers. But their specific cognitive goal is honest to their specific neurological reality.
Interesting.
As for who decides what matters more, that routes directly back to the safeguards. The teacher does not decide. The collective team, driven by the family and the data, decides. It's a recalibration of their education, tailored to the actual life they are going to live. And because of that hard review timeline, the door is never permanently locked.
Decentering the curriculum in favor of the child's functional future just feels so transgressive, though. The education system reveres the curriculum as the ultimate truth of what a child must know. Suggesting the curriculum is secondary to functional reality challenges the core identity of most educators.
It really does. Which brings us to the ultimate, incredibly uncomfortable question Smith asks teachers to sit with. And he explicitly warns that this should not be answered alone.
Okay, what is it?
The question is this: is there a student in your care right now whose educational program is built more around who you hope they will become than who they honestly are?
Wow. Because hope is the default language, the primary currency of the education profession. Suggesting that hope can be a barrier to effective teaching is a devastating critique.
We have to clearly delineate the difference between limiting a student and seeing them. Limiting a student is dismissing their potential based on bias or exhaustion or systemic failure. It's the historical harm we discussed at the top of the hour.
Right.
But seeing a student clearly, honestly recognizing the neurological reality of their cognitive disability and meticulously designing their education around the life they are actually going to live is the complete opposite of dismissal.
Yeah.
It is the most attentive, most respectful, and frankly, the most cognitively demanding form of teaching there is. It is vastly easier to just hand them a modified worksheet, look the other way, and hope for the best. Honest seeing is grueling, meticulous work.
But the lingering doubt remains. The tension between hope and reality is just incredibly heavy here. Mistakes in this arena carry the highest stakes imaginable.
They really do.
If you limit a kid because you convince yourself you are seeing them honestly, but you are actually just clouded by your own exhaustion or a lack of institutional resources, you steal their future. This isn't a theory you can tie up with a neat bow. The risk of getting it wrong is terrifying.
And we cannot tie it up with a neat bow. This is a conversation that intentionally does not have a tidy ending. If you are listening to this right now, do not try to answer Smith's question about your students alone in an empty classroom.
Oh,
Isolation is the enemy of honest seeing. Take this deep dive, share it with a colleague, bring it to a support teacher, take it to an IEP meeting with a family, and hash out the friction. You can find all of Sean Smith's full materials, the specific metrics for the safeguards, and the actual reimagined textbooks at reimaginedlearning.ca. Go look at the concrete tools he uses to execute this work.
it really requires community. Doing this work in isolation is exactly what leads directly back to the dark history we started with.
Absolutely. So as we pack up our bags and turn out the lights in this metaphorical classroom, here is a final philosophical thread to mull over on your drive home. Hope is the fuel that keeps teachers going in this exhausted, critically overloaded profession. We survive on professional hope.
We do.
But if we must replace the comforting, warm glow of that hope with the stark, highly demanding reality of honest seeing, does teaching become an act of radical acceptance or simply a much heavier burden to bear?